What's up, scholars? Today we're going to have a brief introduction to the carbon cycle. Now, this is just an introduction. We're going to be talking a lot more about it. So let's jump right in. So here you can see we have a representation of the carbon cycle. Now, you might have seen things like this, like the water cycle before, which we will talk more about as well. But basically, the carbon cycle is the recycling of carbon between the atmosphere, land, life, and oceans. So the Earth, for the most part, is a closed system. However much carbon the Earth had when it formed 4.5 billion years ago, that's how much carbon it has today. What will happen is where that carbon is stored. So there are sources of carbon. By that, we're specifically talking about things that release carbon into the atmosphere. So sources of atmospheric carbon would be something like fossil fuels or decomposition of dead things, like soil and organic matter. Also, for example, cellular respiration from plants and animals. As they burn their food, they release CO2 into the atmosphere. There are also what we call sinks. Sinks are places, are elements of the land, air, and sea that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So an example of that would be a lot of it will be absorbed by plants as they grow. Plants literally grow by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And other things, like as marine animals die, they get buried in sediments, and then eventually that can form things like fossil fuels. So this is just a quick picture of what the carbon cycle looks like. Now I want to give you some vocabulary and a few other. So Earth has a number of what we might call biogeochemical cycles. So that's where we exchange chemicals, that's part of the name, between the life, the bio part of that funny name, the Earth, the geo part of that name, and the atmosphere. So biogeochemical cycles, I'm going to oversimplify a bunch of what we're going to talk about today, but everything's involved. Both the living and the non-living, the atmosphere, the rocks, everything's involved in all of these cycles, and they occur over different timescales. The two main ones that we're going to focus on, at least for now, are going to be the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, which many of you have learned, and the carbon cycle. That's the biggest one that affects Earth's global climate on the scales of times that concern humans. Now, there are other ones that help plants grow, and again, plants and animals are a big part of this whole system. So the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle, got to give them shouts out, but we are going to just focus on those first two primarily. So some key terms, as I mentioned before, a source is something that releases CO2 into the atmosphere in general. A sink is something that removes CO2 from the atmosphere. So here are some examples. You're going to write these into your notes. So photosynthesis is how plants use sunlight and carbon dioxide to create food. They actually pull carbon dioxide out of the air. I'm going to show you that chemical formula in just a moment. Cellular respiration is essentially the opposite. Organisms like you and me, and plants included, so animals and plants do this. They take food and they break it down using oxygen that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's a source of atmospheric CO2. You've got decomposition, so those are things like fungi that break down dead and rotting materials. So that is a slow breakdown of biotic material. That's a source. Combustion in general, when we're talking about CO2, is the rapid breakdown of biotic materials like wood or fossil fuels. So when you burn fossil fuels or you burn wood, you release lots of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is a source of atmospheric CO2. Then the final one here is usually when we talk about fossil fuels in the context of the carbon cycle, it is a carbon sink. So coal, oil, and natural gas are stored deep in the ground. They're deposited over millennia, and they form the misconception is that they're old dinosaurs. In fact, they're mostly old plants and old algae. But anyway, those are in general, since they're dead plants and they're not allowed to decompose, that's a sink of carbon. It's stored into the earth. But as we burn more and more fossil fuels using combustion, we're releasing some of that into the atmosphere. So I've left out a bunch, like things like how the ocean plays a role here, but we'll talk about that in just not today, but in the future. So here are those two competing main chemical reactions. We'll spend a lot more time looking at these. You've got photosynthesis, where plants take in carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and they create sugar for themselves. And as a byproduct, they release oxygen into the atmosphere. That's why we have oxygen. Thanks, plants. they're smart. They figured out a way to just convert sunlight directly, or with the help of some carbon dioxide, into their food. Now, we have to eat plants, or animals in some cases, to get things like sugar. And what we do when we respire, when we breathe, is we're actually burning that sugar using oxygen. That releases CO2, water, and it gives us ATP, which is the energy, the cellular energy that makes us run. The last thing I wanted to mention is the fact that humans are adding to the, or affecting, I should say, the carbon cycle. So some things that would normally be sinks, again, like fossilized carbon, deep ocean sediments, things like that. As we dig them out of the ground and then we burn them using combustion, you can see in red here, we're adding global CO2 in both sources and in sinks. We're actually adding carbon into the ocean in ways that are not what we might call natural or pre-human intervention. So there's a lot more to this. I just wanted to give folks a quick overview of the carbon cycle. Thanks so much, scholars.